Okay, we're on DAF Yonam and Aleph. Interesting Gemaras here. Ibayilahu tchilas bia kaina o sof bia kaina. The question is like this: at what stage of the act of sexual intercourse does bia affect the marriage? Is it at the beginning or is it at the end? Now, as will become clear from the discussion in the Gemara, you'll see what beginning and end means. Nafkamina kegon sheheraba upashta yada v'kibla kiddushin me'acher. The ramification would be is that if a man did only a partial insertion, and then she sticks out her hand and receives kiddushin from another man, would she be mikudeshes to the first man or mikudeshes to the second man? Don't ask me how such a story took place. But in a situation like that, who is she married to? Now, what becomes clear from the Gemara when we talk about the beginning of Bia or the end of Bia, see, normally when you learn the Gemara, you think the end of Bia is when the man finishes his act, he ejaculates, but that's not what Sof Bia means, or Gemar Bia. Gemar Bia means a full penetration, a full physical contact between man and woman. So that's the first question. That would be the first ramification. Inami l'kohen gadol dekakani besula bebia mai. Or another question would be like this: could a kohen gadol be makadesh his bride with bia? You see, if the ha'ara'ah, the initial act of intercourse, is the marriage, so at the same time that he's rendering her a non-virgin, he's also marrying her, and therefore it's perfectly legal. But you see, a kohen gadol can only marry a besula. If the marriage does not take place until Sof Bia, until the full insertion, and she's rendered a non-virgin at the beginning, at the very first part of insertion, so then he's not allowed to marry her through Bia, because then it turns out that he's marrying a non-virgin, and he's in violation of the Torah. So that's the question. So Amar Amemar Mishmei de Rava Kol Haboyel Daitu Al Gemar Bia. So Amemar says in the name of Rava that anyone who has intercourse for the purposes of Kiddushin is thinking about the Sof Bia, is thinking about the full act in order to be able to marry this woman. That's his matrimonial intent, and that's his anticipation. And therefore, she's not married until the Gemar Bia. And therefore, in both of those cases, the initial penetration is not an act of marriage, so a Kohen Gadol could not marry a Basula through this act. So now the next question is, Bia Nesuin Oisa o Erisin Osa. The Gemara's question is predicated on the fact that the act of Bia is an act of intimacy. And as such, you could argue that just like Nisuin is an act that demonstrates that the man and the wife are married because they're living together, Bia could be not only Kiddushin, but it could be a 2-for-1 deal. Maybe it's both Kiddushin and Nisuin together. Is it that, or is it only Erisin and you have to do chuppah afterwards? So nafkamina liyarsha v'litamila ulahafer nedareha, and the ramification would be, of course, that would a husband, if he just was makadesh with Bia, and then she died, would he inherit her? Or would he, if he's a Kohen, could he be matame for her? Or could he annul her vows at that stage? Because iomarat nisuan osa yarsha mitamilo mefer nedareha. He says, because if it's only Erisin, then he's not able to do any of these things, because these things only apply after Nisuin, to inherit her when she dies, to be metame for her, and to annul her vows, right? But if it's Nisuin, then those things would apply to him. So Amar Abaye Tashma, let's look. Look at the following brisa. Ha'av zakai bebito bekidusheh bekesef bishtaru v'biyah. The first part of the Bryce is talking about a minor, and it says that a father has it's his exclusive purview to decide who and how she's going to get married. So he decides if it's going to be with kesef, shtar, or bia, and which man it's going to be. V'zakai b'mitziasa uv'maisi yadeha uv'haforas nidareha. The father also has exclusive purview after she receives her kiddushin over her mitzia. If she finds anything, the father keeps it. He gets to keep her handiwork, and he gets to annul her vows. Now, this is referring to even before she gets married, but also after she gets married, he has certain purview over those things as well. Umekabel is gita, and the father can also receive a get for his daughter if she's a minor. And ve'eno ochel peros b'chayeha. And finally, he's not allowed to, if let's say she inherits a piece of real estate from her mother's family, the father cannot say, well, I have financial control, give me the peros, give me the produce from that field. No, the father does not have those rights. Nises, but once she gets married, she has nisuin with her husband, yeser lav habal she'oichel peros b'chayeha. That the husband has even a greater control over the wife than the father has over his daughter, and that not only does the husband have the rights to do all of the things that the father has control over financially, but he also gets to eat the peros from a field that belongs to her. That's called nichse milog, as we know. But that's the conclusion of the brisa. The Gemara says, Ketani bio Ketani nises. So what do we want to infer from here? It says that a father has a right to marry off his daughter with kesef shtar and bia, and then afterwards it says, but once she has nisuin, the husband has all rights. What does that imply? Is that even after the father was makadesh her with kesef shtar or bia, there's no nisuin yet. It's only after the nisuin that the husband now has control. So you see from here that bia only does eris and it does not do nisuin as well. The Gemara says no. Kikatani nises asha'ara. Not necessarily so. Maybe bia does both erisin and nisuin. And when it says, but when she gets married, the husband has full control, it's referring to the other methods of kiddushin, kesef and shtar, where it is only erisin and it's not nisuin. So that's not a raya. Amar Rava Tashma. Rava says, listen to the next brisa. Ba shalosh shanim v'yom echad miskadeshes b'bia v'im ba aleha yavam kina'a. Here we're talking about the laws of a girl who's 3 years old. Before she's 3 years old, she's not considered physiologically capable of having sexual intimacy. Once she's 3 years old, we're not advocating that this take place, and of course this is extremely anachronistic for modern times, but physiologically is really what we're discussing. Physiologically, if she is bedded, that is considered to be an act of bia. And therefore, the kiddushin works if the father marries off her daughter at the age of 3. If a yavam has relations with her, that's an act of consummation of yibum. V'chayavan aleha mishomei shesish. Once she's married, if someone else were to have intimacy with her, he would be chayav misa because of an shesish, even though she's only 3 years old. Umetama is boala letame mishkav tachton ke'elya. And furthermore, even though she's prepubescent, if she does have some kind of menstrual discharge, and her husband has relations with her at the time when she's a nida, he will render items tameh, he will render food tameh by either lying on top of them or them lying on top of him. And v'im nises lekohen ocheles betruma, and if she has nisuin with a kohen, she gets to eat truma. Because of course we know, and this is going to be the most of the discussion for the rest of the DAF today, that a Bas Yisrael can only eat her husband Kohen's truma after nisuin, not after erisin. But what you see from here is, we'll get to that in a second. If any one of the ervas that she's not allowed to marry has relations with her, once she hits 3, that person's liable for the death penalty, but she's of course exempt because she's a minor. And finally the Brisa says that if anyone who is puzzled to her, such as a mamzer and a sin and so forth, or a let's say she's not a besul and a kohen gadol, whatever it would mean that is puzzled to her, that would also disqualify her from the kahuna. But the point is, Ketani bio Ketani nises. Here too, the Brisa seems to break the two into 2 separate categories. The first part of the Brisa had said that she could have kiddushin through bia, and now the second part of the Brisa says that once she has nisuin, she gets to eat the kohen's truma. The fact that the Brisa divides the two indicates that bia is not nisuin, bia is only erisin. Again, answering our question. So the Gemara says not necessarily. Hachi ka'amar, ihani nisuin de kohenin hu ocheles betruma. No, really what it could mean is you could read it like this. Bia consummates both erisin and nisuin, and if she has this type of nisuin with a kohen, which could be just through one singular act of bia, she can now start eating truma. So that's not a raya from that brisa either. Now let's look at another brisa. Tashma, uchavar shalach Yochanan ben Bagbag etzel Reb Yehuda ben Beseira l'netzivin. This Brisa says that the famous Tana ben Bagbag sent a message to Yehuda ben Beseira in the town of Netzivan, and he said, "Shamati alecha sha'ata omer arusa bas Yisrael ocheles betruma." I have heard, quoted in your name, that a bas Yisrael can eat a Kohen, her husband Kohen's truma, even after Erisin. She doesn't have to wait for nisuin. And that's what's strange to me, because that really, I didn't think that's the halacha. So Ben Beseira sends back to him, Shalach lo va'ata i'ata omer kain, muchzakani b'cha sha'ata baki b'chadrei Torah, lidrosh b'kal v'chomer. So Ben Beseira sends back a message to Ben Bagbag. He says, and you don't hold that way? I have a fair, reliable assumption about you, that you are a great scholar, and you know how to analyze the most deepest recesses of Torah scholarship. And so you know how to make a kal v'chomer just as well as I do. Iyata yodeya, don't you know the following kal v'chomer that should argue why an arusa should eat her husband Kohen's truma? Umashivcha kenanis she'in bi asa ma'achilasa bitruma, kaspa ma'achilasa bitruma, zu shebi asa ma'achilasa bitruma, inodin shekaspa ma'achilasa bitruma. So listen to the kal v'chomer carefully. He says like this. When a man wants to acquire a shivcha kenanis, a Gentile slave, there's only one way that he can acquire her such that she's allowed to now eat his truma. She has to be kinyan kaspo. She has to be an acquisition through cash. If he tries to acquire her through bia, she's not his servant through that act, and therefore cannot eat his truma. The only way that he can acquire her such that she can eat his truma is through kesef. So surely, a case where a woman can be acquired through bia, surely she should be allowed to eat truma after just being acquired through kesef. In other words, if bia is an act which permits her to eat truma, in the case of marriage, so then surely kesef should be kesef kiddushin should be sufficient to permit a bas Yisrael to eat her husband Kohen's truma, and that shows that even though she's only an arusa, she's allowed to eat truma. Aval, but then Ben Beseira continues and he says, Aval ma e'eseh shaharei amru chachamim ein arusa bas Yisrael ocheles betruma shetikanes lechuppah. But what can I do? The rabbi said that she's not allowed to eat truma until she has chuppah, until she has nisuin. So that's the end of the brisa. What is the Gemara going to prove now? Let's see. Heichi dami. Now, what kind of kal v'chomer was Ben Beseira making? If he meant to say that a woman who's getting married through bia, which is followed by chuppah, is allowed to eat truma, then surely a girl who's getting married through kesef, which is followed by chuppah, is allowed to eat truma. B'teravayu meichel achla. He says that's not talking about an arusa, and if that's the case, then of course both of them are allowed to eat truma because they've had nisuin. Ve'ela b'bia shal yedei chuppah ve'kesef shelo al yedei chuppah hacha tarti v'hacha chada. So what is the kal v'chomer? If you're going to tell me that she's had bia that was followed by chuppah to make her into a full-blown nesua, and he's saying, well, if she can eat truma, then surely a girl who's only had kesef kiddushin without anything else should be able to eat truma. He says that what kind of kal v'chomer is that? If one woman has had two stages of marriage, both erisin and nisuin, she said bia and chuppah, just because she gets to eat truma is not a raya that a girl who's only had kesef kiddushin, has only had one stage. Where do you see that should permit her to eat truma? Elalab. So we have to say, in order for this kal v'chomer to make any sense, is bebia shelo al yedei chuppah v'kesef shelo al yedei chuppah. That what Ben Beseira was saying is like this: if a girl who just has bia is automatically allowed to eat truma, even though she only had bia and did not have chuppah, then surely a girl who only had kesef without chuppah, surely she should be allowed to eat truma, because you see that works for a shivcha kenanis as well. So the Gemara says, "Iomart bishlam nisuan osa mishum hachi pshita le da'alima le la bia mikesef." Ela iomart kiddushin osa ma'ishna hacha de pshita le o ma'ishna hacha de misafkale. The Gemara's question is like this: if you tell me that the singular act of bia for the sake of kiddushin also consummates nisuin, then I can understand why Ben Beseira made a kal v'chomer the way he made it. He says, it's obvious to me that when you have an act of bia with this girl, since you're doing both kiddushin and nisuin, she's allowed to eat truma. And if that's the case, that a singular act of bia works to allow her to eat truma, then surely, using the kal v'chomer from Shifcha Kenanis, surely a singular act of kesef should allow this girl to eat truma as well. And that's the reason why it was obvious to Ben Beseira that bia permits her to eat truma, right? Because otherwise, why is it so obvious to Ben Beseira that when she has bia, she's allowed to eat truma any more than when she has kesef, she's allowed to eat truma? Where does he get that from? It must be that Ben Beseira holds that bia consummates both erisin and nisuin. So this is our raya, says the Gemara. The fact that Ben Beseira could make such a kal v'chomer is a raya that bia enacts both erisin and nisuin. So Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak la'olam ema lecha bebia shal yedei chuppah v'kesef shal yedei chuppah. No, Rav Nachman says not necessarily so. Really, I'll tell you, the kal v'chomer was like this. Ben Beseira was talking about a case of where if a girl can eat truma after having had bia and chuppah, then surely she should be allowed to have truma after only have had kesef of kiddushin. Udikamar tacha tarti v'hacha chada. He says, and what about your question? Well, then what kind of kal v'chomer is it? What do you mean? Just because she had a two-step process with bia and she gets to eat truma, why does that automatically indicate that if she only had one step of kesef, she should be allowed to eat truma? So he says, kal v'chomer miha isay. The kal v'chomer would work like this. V'hachi shalach lei. And this is what he meant to say. Uma shivcha kenanis she'ein bi'asa ma'achilasa bitruma afilu al yedei chuppah. He says, look at a shivcha kenanis. A shivcha kenanis, if you do bia, and then you follow that bia with the act of chuppah. You make a big chuppah for your shivcha kenanis. It does absolutely nothing. Because since you're not marrying her, you can't marry her. She's a non-Jew. So these acts are completely invalid. And therefore she cannot eat, if you're a Kohen, she cannot eat your truma with these acts. Kaspa machilasa below chuppah. And yet, the singular act of just paying money for her immediately allows her to eat your truma. So therefore, zusha bi'asa ma'achilasa b'truma al yedei chuppah, eino din shekaspa ma'achilasa b'truma below chuppah. So that was Ben Beseira's argument. He says, well then surely in a case where bia followed by chuppah does work to allow her to eat truma, then surely a singular act of kesef, which works by a shivcha kenanis, should work with this girl as well to allow her to eat truma. So therefore, the kal v'chomer works in such a way where you cannot infer from this brisa that bia accomplishes both erisin and nisuin. It could be that bia only accomplishes erisin. And the argument that Ben Beseira was making is that bia, when coupled with chuppah, allows a girl to eat truma. So then kal v'chomer, that kesef alone, which works by a shivcha kenanis, should work to allow her to eat truma as well. Let's continue the brisa. Avol ma e'eseh shaharei amru chachamim ein arusa bas yisrael locheles b'truma shetikanes l'chuppah mishum de'ula. Period. And now we explain the rest of the brisa. What was Ben Beseira saying? He was saying, but what can I do? Even though I've proven through a kal v'chomer that midioraisa, as soon as a girl has had erisin, she's allowed to eat truma. But what can I do? The rabbi said that if a girl is in arusa and she hasn't had nisuin yet, she's not allowed to eat truma. Why? Because of Ula's concern. Now, Ula says this back on DAF Hey. What did Ula say? Ula said that really, midioraisa, a girl can eat truma once she had erisin. But why do we not allow her? Because where is she living when she had erisin? She's living in her father's house. If the Kohen gives her his truma, she's going to bring it home and share it with her family members, and it's going to turn out that non-Kohanim are going to be eating truma. So therefore they said, wait until you're married to the guy with nisuin, and then you'll be able to eat truma. Now, the question is, Ben Bagbag? What about Ben Bagbag? Why does Ben Bagbag say that even midioraisa, a girl should not be allowed to eat truma until nisuin? So gabi shivcha kenanis lo shir bikinyana, hacha shir bikinyana. The answer is very simple. A shivcha kenanis, the complete act of acquisition is accomplished through kesef. And therefore, just paying kesef for her allows her to eat truma. But when you give kesef of kiddushin to a girl for marriage, it's a two-step process. You've only completed one step of a two-step process. And that's why Ben Bagbag says that it's no analogy. That's why he doesn't hold of Ben Beseira's Kal V'chomer. And he says, even if you've just given her kesef, even though it works by a Shivcha Kenanis, it's not going to work by a Bas Yisrael to let her eat Truma. Now Ravina Omar, so Ravina says that's your interpretation of the Brisa. I have a whole different way of learning the Brisa, which also does not compel us to say that Bia accomplishes both Erisin and Nisuin. Let's see how Ravina learns it. He says, Omer midioraisa mifsha pshita le da'achla, o midirabanan hu deshalach le v'hachi shalach le. Ben Bagbag was clear also that midioraisa, a girl who's only had Erisin, is allowed to eat truma. He also understood that midirabanan, there's a ban on a girl who's had erisin from eating truma. What his message that he sent to Ben Beseira was as follows: Shamati alecha shata omer arusa bas Yisrael acheles betruma v'lo chayshos l'simpon. I've heard you say that really midirabanan, even midirabanan, in Arusa should be allowed to eat truma because you're not worried about simpon. Now, simpon is a different consideration from what Ula said. Ula said the reason why an Arusa can't eat truma is because she's going to feed it to her family. But the idea of simpon that Ben Bagbag is concerned about is like this. Now, when you marry a girl, you give her kesef kiddushin, you're assuming that she's just as beautiful when she's undressed as when she's dressed. She's got a beautiful face. Why should you assume anything else? The night of the wedding, you discover that there's a very serious and significant bodily blemish on places where she's normally clothed, and you only discover that the night of the wedding. Now, if a husband discovers that the night of the wedding, he could say mekach tos. He could say, this is marriage under false pretenses. It annuls the marriage automatically, right? That's what simpon means. Simpon means a blown deal, a null deal, because it was done under false pretenses. The husband could claim simpon, the marriage is off, the marriage is annulled, and that's the reason why she shouldn't, Ben Bagbag says, she shouldn't be allowed to eat truma midarabanan, because we should worry that by the night of the wedding, he's going to yell that it's a mekach tos, and all of the truma that she therefore ate, as an arusa, she was never an arusa to begin with. That's the reason why Ben Bagbag says she shouldn't be allowed to eat truma. Because who knows what's going to happen the night of the wedding. And he says, I heard that you, Ben Beseira, hold that you don't have to worry about that. So my question is, why don't you have to worry about it? So shalach lei va'ata i'ata omer kain muchzakani b'cha shata boki b'chadrei Torah lidrosh b'kal v'chomer. So that's why Ben Beseira sends him back a message. He says, I'm surprised at you, Ben Bagbag. You're a great scholar. You know how to make a kal v'chomer yourself. Don't you know the following? I'ata yodea umashivcha kenanis she'ein bi'asa ma'achilasa b'truma kaspa ma'achilasa b'truma v'lo chayshinon l'simpon. He says, look, you can't acquire a shivcha kenanis through bia. You can only acquire her through kesef. There's no intimate knowledge that you have of her body. You just pay kesef, and once you pay kesef, she can automatically start eating truma. So therefore, zusha bi'asa ma'achilasa b'truma. So surely in a case where your physical intimacy of having bia with this girl is going to immediately allow her to eat truma, because once you're able to see her, all of her body, you're not going to proceed unless you are satisfied with what you see, and therefore, of course, you don't have to worry about simpon after that. So she can eat truma immediately after bia. So surely she should be allowed to eat truma even though she only had kesef. If it works for a shivcha kenanis, it should work for a woman who is getting married as well, because there you see there's even more of a connection. You can marry her with bia as well. So if you can marry her with kesef and you're not worried about simpon by shivcha kenanis, you shouldn't worry about simpon by a girl that you're marrying with kesef. So eno din shekaspa machilasa b'truma v'lo nechosh l'simpon. But then Ben Beseira says, but I still agree that midarabanan she's not allowed to eat truma, not because of simpon, but rather because of a different consideration of olmoes shrei amru chachamim arusa bas Yisrael eina ocheles b'truma ad shetikanes l'chopa mishum de'ula. In other words, Ben Beseira was responding back to Ben Bagbag. You and I do not disagree about halacha. We both agree that midioraisa an arusa can eat, midorabanan she cannot eat. But you're concerned about simpon, and I'm not concerned about that, said Ben Beseira, because of the kal v'chomer that I just gave you. But I do agree that she cannot eat midorabanan, not because of simpon, but rather because of Ula's consideration that she's going to feed it to the rest of her family because she's still living with her mishpacha, who are Yisraelim. So now the Gemara says, Uben bagbag. What is Ben Babag's response to this kal v'chomer? Why does it not hold of Ben Beseira's kal v'chomer? Very simply, simpon ba'avadim lesle. He says, because what do you have to worry about simpon, about annulling the sale, just because she has a physical blemish underneath her clothes? He says, imu min shebagolai hu hakachazile. He says, when you purchase a slave, a Gentile slave, male or female, if you're worried about a physical defect that's going to prevent her from doing her work, well, you can see that right away. Does she walk with a limp? Does she have a hump or whatever it is? He says, he says, and if it's talking about a physical defect that is only discernible once she removes her clothes, what difference does that make? You hired her to work. You hired her to be able to clean the house. You didn't hire her to be able to undress. So therefore, what difference does it make if she has a blemish underneath her clothing? She's just going to be as good of a worker. So therefore, you can't claim simpon just because she may have a physical defect. He says, that's the reason why a shivcha kananis can eat truma right away once you pay for her, because you see, it's self-evident that there's nothing wrong with her, right? But with the girl that you're going to marry, by giving kesef, there is the possibility of annulling the marriage in the future, because the wedding night, you're going to see her undressed, and that's going to create an annulment of the marriage. And further, the Gemara says, Nim saganavo kuvyustos higio. He says, and what are you going to argue? That maybe you'll discover later that the shivcha kenanis is a ganaf, or someone who kidnaps children. He says, you know what? There's a law in Bava Basra that says that if you sell someone a slave, an Eved Kanani, and that later the Eved Kanani turns out to be a ganaf, you can't annul the sale, because there's an assumption that all avadim are ganavim, and therefore you got to protect. When I was living in Southern California, we would employ domestic help that came from Latin America, right? So it was known, right, Reb David? You knew you don't leave your jewelry unlocked in your house if you've just hired domestic help, because there's an assumption that because many of them come from cultures where this is acceptable to steal from the rich, so then you don't leave your jewelry out. So you can't claim, oh, I didn't know she was a ganef. Well, you should have known she was a ganef. That's the culture, right? So therefore, you can't make that claim. Mayomart listim mezuyin o nichtav l'malchus hana kala islahu. So what are you going to argue? Maybe you purchase an Eved or a Shivcha, and it turns out that they're a terrorist, right? Maybe they work for ISIS, right? Or maybe you discover that they're on the king's FBI most wanted list. He says you can't claim that after the fact, because you're supposed to do a background search. Supposed to do your due diligence. Those things people know about. If a guy's on the no-fly list, you would know that. Except maybe not in Canada with Trudeau. I'm not sure. But whoops, I shouldn't have said that. Sorry. Anyway, the Gemara now says Mechdi. Bein lamar uvein lamar lo ach lamai beinayu. So the question now is like this. In the conclusion of the Gemara, Ben Beseira and Ben Bagbag both agree that midirabanan an arusa cannot eat truma. What difference does it make? In other words, we just said they agree in halacha. So what are they arguing about? Ben Bagbag holds it's because you have to worry about simpon. Ben Beseira says it's because she's going to feed it to her family. What difference does it make? Midirabanan, they both agree that she can't eat truma. The Gemara says no. There's three nafkaminas. Ika benayu kibel masar v'holach. What would be the case? What if a husband presents a girl with kesef kiddushin and he says, Arya mikudeshes li, and I accept whatever physical defect may be under your clothes, I hereby accept. What if he says that? So if you hold like Ben Bagbag, then it's a completely valid marriage and she starts eating truma right away. Because we're not choshesh for simpon, because he explicitly disclaimed the possibility of claiming simpon. But if you hold like Ben Beseira that it's a concern she's going to feed her family members, so then she still can't eat truma. The next case would be Masar and Vaholach, which are really two sides of the same coin. Masar is if a father sends off his daughter to go, she already had Kiddushin, and now the father sends her away from home in order to have nisuin at her new husband's town. In that situation, according to Ben Beseira, since she's already left her house, she should be allowed to start eating truma right away. But according to Ben Bagbag, if it's the concern is simpon, then this concern is still there, and she should not be allowed to eat truma. And the same thing with halach is where the father escorts his daughter. If the father sends a shaliach, or he himself escorts his daughter, so then again you don't have the same concern that she's going to feed her family members, because it's only her father, and he'll know not to eat the truma, and therefore she could start eating truma according to Ben Beseira. But if the concern is simpon, so then the concern is still there. Have a wonderful day, Rabbi.